My era is better than yours. Slightly flippant title to this talk. But it's one of those curious things in historical fiction that some periods really are better than others. Certainly in terms of general popularity, certainly in terms of individual preference, certainly in terms of what people actually choose to buy and read. Philip Stephen will be keeping peace in this talk for us. Or will he? Philip's work first came to my attention through Giles Kristian. He made a terrific short film and trailer for Odin's Wolves. He's followed this up recently with a trailer for God of Vengeance, Giles' fabulous new novel. So he's obviously okay with Vikings. Lately, I know Philip's been working to finish the Romani Walk film. Authors Tony Richards, Ben Kane, and Russ Whitfield, dressed in legionary uniform, were walking from Capua to Rome in aid of combat stress and Médecins Sans Frontières. Tony Richards from that group will be speaking here tomorrow. So that's a foot in at least 2 camps. And I haven't asked about the rest. So ladies and gentlemen, Philip Stevens.
Thank you. I think this is definitely the most contentious talk that will take place here. There is actually a security team outside on standby in case things get too heated. And also, it's an argument that's been solved today. Tudor. Isn't that what happened? But yeah, you know, it is an odd thing, the period of history that actually sparks someone's imagination, the thing that attracts you to a particular period in history, or sometimes more than one, sometimes many. But I think it's definitely interesting from a reader's perspective of different authors' interpretations of the same period, and whether their interpretation is the same as your own. Now, I'm interested, I'm going to go through everybody in a second, but I'm interested mainly in what is it about those periods that makes them compelling to the writer. I was going to introduce everyone, but it's actually just going to be, earlier on, the act of getting people to introduce themselves is far simpler. So I'm just going to go along the line, and if you could introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about your period, where the period is you write.
Okay, I'll go first.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, I'm Angus Donald. I'm writing a series of books about Robin Hood and Alan Dale, and they're set in the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th centuries. It's the time of Richard the Lionheart, the Third Crusade, King John, Magna Carta. It's that period, one man's life, and I think my era is better than all of the others.
Solved.
There we are. You'll go ahead.
Right, that's that then.
Harry.
Hi, I'm Harry Sidebottom. I write novels set in the Roman Empire. They're all so far set in the 3rd century AD, a time of war, crisis, revolution, full of exciting stuff. And I'm finding it hard to bring myself to say that obviously, self-evidently, my period is the best.
I'm Giles Kristian. I have a very big axe.
This isn't a family show, is it?
Well, so I write Viking fiction and also English Civil War, so they're obviously very, very different in themselves, so I don't know which one I'm going to be arguing for, but probably the Viking period.
Okay, I'm Suzannah Dunn, and I'm mid-Tudor. I don't know anything about either end of that, but I've got Tudor, and to be honest, I think it's a bit crass, the Tudor, isn't it, to like the Tudor, you know, so I know I'm on a losing wicket.
And I'm Antonia Hodgson. I'm the author of The Devil in the Marshalsea, which is set in 1720s, so I'm Georgian, and I've already been told by at least one panellist they don't do Georgian, so not interested. So I think I'm on a losing streak as well. Should we just leave now?
Less of the defeatist attitude.
Yes.
Down this end of the table.
Hopefully what's not going to happen at the end of this is all the authors in their particular eras end up writing in the winning era for the rest of it. It would make it very, very interesting for the rest of us. Okay, Angus, we'll start with you. Could you start by telling us a bit about what inspired you to write in your period?
Briefly, I discovered something called the 12th century Renaissance, which I had never heard of at school or since, and I was absolutely entranced by this particular flowering of culture and arts and music and poetry, architecture, law, all the rest of it, which happened in the 12th century. It's not very well known. And my hero is Robin Hood, but he's a gangster. He's not a terribly nice man. And I needed another hero, and I have Alan Dale, who is the two of them are in tandem as the heroes of my books. Alan Dale is a trouvère, which is what the northern French called troubadours, and he's a poet and a musician, and he plays a sort of violin-type instrument called a vielle. And he sings, and he's rather poetic and sensitive, and he is the sort of moral heart of the stories. Robin Hood is much more brutal and goes around killing people and taking their money. So having this trouvère allowed me access to the music and poetry of the age, and also the chivalry. And the reason that I think that it's all part of one flowering, that my era is better, is because you do have this extraordinary revolution in a way. Up until the beginning of the 12th century, and people are going to quibble about this, but broadly speaking, there were two types of music. There were sort of manly lays, songs about Roland and Charlemagne and stuff, and killing people, having the hero with a bunch of dead people at his feet, and then you had the other kind, which was church music. And in the 12th century, a new kind of music, I use music and poetry pretty much as synonyms, because trouvères played and recited poetry at the same time, so there wasn't much distinction. This was called the new music, or the new poetry, and for the first time since the Roman Empire, I have to give that point to Harry, and Ovid and all the rest of them, we started to have attitudes towards women changing. Women became venerated, they were looked up to, they were seen as objects of adoration, not just sort of political pawns. They were still political pawns, obviously, but you do have this huge sea change in culture towards women at this time, and it came out of the 12th century Renaissance. You have chivalry, you have the courts of love, you have something called fin amour, courtly love, and poetry begins to extol feminine virtues. The sacred feminine becomes something that people are interested in. There's a cult of the Virgin Mary rising at the same time. You've got a feminization to a small extent. Okay, there's still big hairy men in hauberks and axes chopping each other up, but there is the beginning. There is the beginnings of a new sensibility towards art and culture. Alongside this revolution in poetry, where people were singing about love and romance and this peculiar kind of adulterous and unrequited love, which was described, I mean, you probably know about courtly love, but it was described rather well by someone called Francis X. Newman, who sounds like a villain, but he's not. He's a professor of medieval literature. He said, courtly love was a love at once illicit and morally elevating, passionate and disciplined, humiliating and exalting, human and transcendent. And people were writing about love in a very complex and interesting way for the first time since the Roman Empire. So I think that my era... doing for time?
Are you okay?
Keep going? Okay. From this era, you get the beginnings... Well, I'm not quite sure how... Okay, basically, my era is better than everyone else because this is the era in which the love story was born. This is the era... Okay, this is the era...
I can see what he's done there.
It's quite cunning, isn't it? My cunning knows no bounds. This is the first time, you've got these lovely stories. And if you wanted to, you could trace modern novels from 50 Shades of Grey to Pride and Prejudice, not quite so novel, all the way back to this idea of courtly love and romance and unrequited love. It all comes from this period, the end of the 12th century, basically. Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's great play, was influenced heavily by ideas about courtly love, and all novels and love stories and the kind of things that we all do today come from the 12th century.
It's a good case. It's also a surprising case. It wasn't the one I was expecting for this. You know, violent and visceral books about a gangster in the medieval ages, but no, his reasoning is love. It's a beautiful thing. Harry, what inspired you?
I'm not going to talk about that now because I'm so inspired by Angus's talk. I'm just going to move my notes away and I'll borrow his again. And I'll just tell you a story instead. There's a little shepherd boy and a shepherd girl, and they live somewhere on a Greek island, and they're very young, they're adolescent, they fall in love. It's a very chaste love because despite looking after animals, they haven't quite worked, love's true end out yet. And then the pirates come along. They're always pirates or brigands, nasty foreigners, and they kidnap the girl. And she's sold into several brothels, but miraculously always keeps her virginity. Despite being, of course, the most attractive woman that's ever been seen in the city of Ephesus. And the hero, who, let's be honest, is not very bright, goes around looking for her. And this, of course, involves him going the wrong way 55 times during the story. And killing an awful lot of people. In the end, he, by some weird chance, finds her in a brothel, rescues her, he takes her home, and then guess what? They turn out not to be a little shepherd and shepherdess, but the long-lost children of a local noble family. And a god descends, they get married, and all the hoi polloi cheer wildly as Greek elite culture and love is actually triumphant again. What I've given you is the plot of every ancient Greek novel, of which there are about 8. And it's always the same. I mean, these novels are actually quite fun, but the plot is that. Unless, of course, you read the anti-novel, which is The Ass, in which she certainly doesn't remain a virgin, nor does anyone else in the book, or remain alive. I decided to launch into this impromptu lecture on Greek novels because clearly love wasn't invented by Angus in the 12th century.
Touché.
And nor acts of extreme violence invented by Giles as a Viking. That's why the Roman era is best.
That's kind of an argument.
Okay. Well, I wasn't really going to do that. What I'm going to talk about...
Do love again.
Yes. There's this sensitive, hairy Viking. No.
With a big axe.
Yes.
But a lovely line in interior decor.
Now, what are we even talking about? Right. I feel we've sort of tangent.
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think we're very much on the...
So, I wrote my first series about the Vikings because my mother's Norwegian. I grew up, spent a lot of time in the fjords in Norway, and you can't help but think about Vikings when you're in that kind of environment. But the period I'm writing in is a period before recorded history. I'm writing about a culture that was illiterate. The only records we have were written by the other side, the losers.
He means the English.
As I said. And the thing, it's one of those rare instances where history was written by the losers. And so we don't have much information to go on, which allows me to do what I want to do, and that is to tell the story, to entertain. And so the historical side of the period I'm writing in doesn't get in the way, and it allows me to just be completely creative. No, I know what you're thinking.
Fantasy.
It allows me to tell the story and make the story the most important thing about it, and write a book that I hope will entertain people, because I'm writing fiction. That's what I want to do. I want to entertain. Now, I've also been writing this English Civil War series, so I've kind of seen both sides, because that is a very source-rich environment to get involved in, and it's relatively very recent, and a lot of people know an awful lot about it, which is annoying. And you're writing about a church, and you have to, and it probably still looks the same as it did in the time, so you really do have to get it right. So going back to the Vikings is really refreshing because I just get to tell the story. And that's, for me, that's why I do what I do. I'm not writing non-fiction. I want to entertain you. And for that reason, I'm able to do that completely and freely.
So basically, it's just about the amount of complaints you get.
There are no complaints for that.
Not
He's got a big axe. There's no complaining.
There are pictures of the axe on the internet, and that's why there are very few complaints.
Was it downloaded from the iCloud?
That just came out about stars releasing pictures of their big axes. Yes. Thank you, Giles. Suzannah.
Yeah, all right. Hang on a minute. I've got some notes because I can't remember why I like my era. I came at writing about I came at the Tudors really not because they were Tudors, but because I never read a historical novel. That's not kind of true, but I didn't come from that world, and I'm not a historian and everything. What I wanted to do was write about Anne Boleyn, and she happened to be a Tudor, so that's why I've ended up there. I started with her, and Anne Boleyn. Fascinated by Anne Boleyn, as we often are, because she was rude and uncompromising and outspoken and all those things. I thought, oh, yes, I'll have a go at her and look at the shape of her story. Lovely. Oh, I'm getting so excited there. That lovely novelist shaped her story, long rise, short fall, that sort of thing. Wanted to get going with Anne Boleyn. She happened to be a Tudor. But then, because I didn't know any of this stuff, I had to do an awful lot of reading pretty quickly. And I discovered that the Tudors were really what historians would call the early moderns. And I like that. That says it all to me. OK, so they're early, so there's a lot that's a bit strange, and I had to learn, but they're also modern, and I like that. We're on the cusp. Now, Anne Boleyn, quintessentially modern, she was the modern girl, so that's where I was coming from, but it took me elsewhere. And then there I found the Reformation, and I think that's why my era is. But I mean, come on, if they come up with anything, Reformation, what can I say? What kind of, can I say what sort of made us who we are? I do think that. Come on, the Reformation, it's big. I know a generation later you're beheading a king, but then we got another one after that, whereas, and it all just went back to where it was before, but not with the Reformation. So I think the Reformation, but talking about, so I'm going to bang on about the Reformation a little bit, but actually, coming back to Anne Boleyn, another thing I like about the Tudors on my little list is big women. We've got big women in this era. I mean, we've got a good clutch of monarchs to start with, which they haven't got. Depends who you count in there. Can we count Jane Grey? And she was more interesting than you think, actually. We've got Mary. Interesting is certainly a word for her. We've got Elizabeth. We've got, can I co-opt Mary, Queen of Scots? Because I know she sort of, strictly speaking, wasn't Tudor, but she was also there. So we've got all those big ladies, and many more big ladies when I did my reading, from your Besses of Hardwicks to your Countesses of Suffolk to your Catherine Parr. She was a big woman, I mean, not, she was a big women. So big women, I would go with that. Lots of ladies for me to get on with, that's good. And then I have to say the word to use soap opera. I have to, obviously, it's a little bit tedious, but I have to bring in the soap opera element. And you're sitting there thinking, well, Henry and his 6 wives, that's the sort of things that kings did in those days. No, they didn't. It was just as shocking, I think, really almost just as shocking then as it is to us now. It was madness. So you've got all of that stuff going on, and then all the stuff after him with, boy kings and Bloody Mary, the phantom pregnancy. Come on. I mean, that's horrible, but it's fantastic, isn't it? Just amazing things going on. So soap opera, I'm looking down my list. There are more serious things, but actually, big women soap opera, Reformation, that's quite big to be getting on with. I think that's why, really.
I see. I'm of the opinion that your opening statement about not being able to win this was actually a poker move.
I'm known for those.
And we've got a lot of big women in there. And obviously, as we all know, Tudor is the period to sell. Antonia.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons I was really drawn to the Georgian period is I'm drawn to neglected, abandoned things, and to me the Georgians are somewhat forgotten. You do have these amazing novelists writing medieval, writing all the periods we talked about, Tudor as well. And it just struck me, as a big fan of historical fiction as well, this was a period that I didn't know as much about as I'd like, and the more I thought about it, the more I researched, the more fascinated I became. And one of the big points for me of connection were the pictures of Hogarth and, you know, the Rake's Progress. And I looked at these people. I live in London. You know, I love the city. And I saw these people sitting, drinking, whoring, basically mucking around. They were real urban people. They're people that I started to really recognise. They're vomiting in corners. And,
not a lot's changed. No.
Nothing's changed. And that's, I have this line is, you know, about one of the things, the great things I love about all historical fiction actually is what you learn is that how much we've changed and how little we've changed. And I think all of the periods teach us that, and it's something really powerful and wonderful to learn is that people have fundamentally, I think, you know, still, I mean, falling in love feels the same, seeing a friend feels the same, having a hangover feels the same. There are massive differences, but those connections are really important, and there was something about those pictures, and then when I started doing more research, you know, the people that I met that seemed very familiar and fascinating. It was also a period, you know, specifically, you know, censorship had broken down and people were able to start speaking as they really wanted. You know, this was the time of the pamphlets and, you know, huge satire, people mocking the king and queen, quite irreverent. And it was before Empire. So it was this sort of little chink of time, which again, has almost felt more modern than the Victorians to me, because you know, there was none of that stiff upper lip at all. There was a Swiss traveller who came through London in 1726 who said, "Debauch runs riot with an unblushing countenance." And he was quite disapproving of that. But, you know, there were people having a whale of the time on the streets. It was very dangerous. It was, you know, brutal in many ways. But in another way, it reminds me of sort of, say, how Rio is now, or Mumbai. You know, it's a place on the make. London was the biggest city in the world. And people were flooding there because it was safe, you know, in comparison to all the other places. Voltaire, when he was exiled from Paris, came to London and he said, "I like the English, they're free thinkers, and you can only half live if you only half think." And so people were really excited to be living in London at the time. It was the place to be, and it was the place to have, you know, radical thought. And so the kind of combination of, you know, gin, free thought, and satire really appealed to me, and that's one of the many reasons I love the period.
Yeah, and also syphilis, that was the other thing.
Yeah, syphilis, you know. Yeah, that too.
Which is a seller, in my opinion.
Yeah, you know, it tends to be natural. If you've got brothels and drink, the syphilis tends to follow. So I suppose it's a cause and effect there, yeah.
You touched on something a minute ago, Giles, which was... You touched on something a second ago, which was the difference between material you can draw and source material. And obviously, the further back you go, in some respects, there's a bit of a gap where material is a little bit sparse. But certainly, for discussion, do you think it is easier writing about the Georgian, or do you think because there is so much material to take from, or are you actually, as Giles says, kind of limited because you have to stick to the facts?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? The whole thing I think we'll find with when you're writing historical fiction is how you have to do all the research and then leave most of it out, because if you put too much in, it just stifles the narrative. So a lot of what you're doing is researching, getting to know everything, and then only using probably about 5% of it, you know, of the time. Well, I quite like, what I did was, you know, with my first book anyway, was to pick a very particular place and particular time, and that helped me. So, you know, I wrote about a prison, the Marshalsea, at a particular time, September 1727. And while I still had to do all the sort of research around what people were eating and, you know, what they wore, and you know, it did help narrow it down, because, you know, I do think otherwise it would have been incredibly difficult to sort of span over, like, you know, 30 years. You know, so that helped me, certainly starting off. But I think I would find it difficult equally if I didn't have any research and that I just had to make it all up myself. That in its own way is quite, you know, a lot of work.
I suppose there's kind of what you tackled, isn't it? You fill in gaps to a certain degree.
Yeah, with the English Civil War as a period to write in, I think it's such a huge subject, the politics and the religion and just the society, the changes that were happening in society. And the last thing I want to do is actually chronicle the English Civil War. That's not what I want to do. So even though we were talking earlier, and publishers have to put you in a box and say, okay, English Civil War, Viking, Roman, whatever. Well, actually, my books probably won't teach you an awful lot about the English Civil War. But what it is a story of the two brothers and the sister, and that's the world they inhabit, but it's their story. And I think that's the thing that you were saying. You have to find your angle.
Yeah.
Just one little, it could be a small angle, a small window into that world, and then go with that, rather than trying to encompass the whole environment.
Is it a bonus though? I mean, because I think Antonia was right in saying that if you were to span a 30-year gap, the changes in that period of history, to documented now, for example, 30 years ago to us today, it was great change. But we aren't so, or do you believe we aren't so questioning of, say, ancient Rome?
Well, there's a terrible danger of telescoping it all down
Yeah.
and assuming there is no change because of our sources. In terms of the sort of historical thing and the Giles storytelling, I've done two different things. In my first series of novels, The Warrior of Rome, the surface story is entirely made up. I mean, I've just invented, well, actually some of the characters are real, but I've made up the surface story. What was terribly important to me was to try and get the underlying history as right or as plausible as I could. By that I mean, obviously, the realien, the clothes, the food, the weapons, that stuff. But much more important...
The tunic colour.
The tunic colour and just how long your spear is, yeah. How big your axe is. But much more important was trying to get into the way they thought and not sort of just, stick someone like me in a toga. And that's the bit I tried to get right, the mentalities of the whole thing. Well, having said which, when I got my first publishing deal, I teach university, and my boss, the professor, did congratulate me on picking a period in the 3rd century AD, I quote, so obscure, no one can prove you wrong about it.
That's an interesting point, actually, about mentality, because is that something that you all strive for? That is to create, rather than taking the reader's mentality of a modern-day person and putting them basically in a different period, do you strive to capture that mentality? And if so, is it actually sometimes unsavoury? Because I know that all of your books are quite violent, but there's the violent mentality behind it as well.
Yeah, I mean, for medieval period, I find it incredibly difficult to get particularly into an age where faith was so important, where it ruled practically everything you did, everything you thought, all the structures of your life, from tithes that you'd have to pay to the church to genuine fear of hell, the power of church figures. Trying to get into that mindset is incredibly difficult, but you have to try and do it. Just while we're talking about Christianity, I would say, I'm afraid that this is cribbed someone else's idea, and I'm just going to pretend it's my own. If the Middle Ages hadn't been so strong in their defence of Christianity, we wouldn't have the value on the individual that we have today. Our modern liberal society comes from that brutal and violent defence of Christianity, I think, from the Middle Ages, which waned in its power but left us with this legacy of value of the individual, democracy, the idea of fairness, and not arbitrary power. And that comes from my era. Just to drag it back to the whose era is better, it's mine.
See, that's interesting as well, because with the Tudors especially, there is a marked sort of bridge between the previous extensive violence of the Middle Ages, moving forward
more personal
to the more personal violence. And that's, once again, back to mentality. That's a very different thing of writing, isn't it? People who are actively, I mean, both in England and Europe, really quite murderous and horrible.
Yes. What do you want me to say to that? Yes. When I was writing, I have written about Mary, and actually that's just too big to get. I can't go into that now. I'm just thinking about how that, the burnings and dealing with that, and just thinking about what you were saying though about do you sort of dress up in a toga, as it were, or not? In theory, I think, yeah, don't dress up in a toga, don't do that thing. But actually, I do that thing. I do put a modern sensibility into my characters, because I think you can go either way or no way in particular, but I think I'm trying to, I haven't really even thought about it, but my instinct is to narrow the gap. You know, you either want to stress the alien, don't you, or not, or you're working on that, or you're doing the other thing and sort of trying to bring, you know, to draw the similarities. And I think I'm drawn to drawing the similarities, as it were. And as I say, I didn't even reason that out, but I think that's what I do. So I am sometimes a bit embarrassed, and I think I am just putting a kirtle on, really. But that is what I do. And the faith thing, yeah, there are other things as well, your ideas of progress and modernity, a lot of other things that I'm aware that I don't touch with a barge pole, and I should touch with a barge pole. They're enormous. But actually the faith thing, for Tudors, I translate it modernly into its politics, really. Mm-hmm. It's how you live your life, who you take as your source of authority. And I can understand, I do a translation in my head, and I think, well, it's like politics for us today, and that's how I do it, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. Is that a case in point then? Do you think that if we are too accurate with our depiction of history, and I suppose this is slightly off topic, but if we are completely accurate with both the surroundings and mentalities, that actually we're alienating the readers?
I had a really good example of this with the first book. The first Viking book that I wrote. There's a band of warriors, and they go to a village, and they do what Vikings did. Now, I had to make a decision whether the main character, who obviously I would like the reader to root for, I had to make the decision about whether he would be involved in this terrible action, and it was a rape, and all the others were sort of doing what they wanted. And I thought, well, to a modern audience, what will they think about the main character, but getting involved in this? But but it felt so wrong to put our sensibilities and morals onto the character. Of course, if he's caught up in this band of warriors and they're doing this, of course he's going to do it. And so I had this discussion with my publisher, and decided, yeah, I would keep it in, and I would have him, you know, commit this rape. Because it felt wrong to do anything else.
A medical emergency that prevented him from some loss of fervour, perhaps.
That's actually a really nice idea.
Yeah. Should have talked to him. That's historical.
You see, that's the voice of experience.
We're back to your axe again, are we?
Sorry,
yeah, all novels are thinly veiled autobiography.
I was just going to say, you know, it's interesting to hear Giles say, and of course he's going to join him. Well, we don't know that. He might not have done. I don't know. And it's about reimagining, isn't it? So you could, I'm not saying, I think you probably, you know, I'm sure you did the right thing, but I thought that was interesting that you said that. And my line is always, well, maybe they didn't, you know, I'll do it differently. Maybe they didn't. You're always thinking, what if, as well, aren't you, in fiction? And so there's a little bit of space there. I don't know. And some people will go with it or they won't as readers.
I would say, particularly with the main character, it comes down to understanding their character from the start, which again, it sounds like you did. It's a character and time. You know, if you know your character well, you kind of get a sense of what they would and wouldn't do, even within that period. You know, that period, and there are always gradations. You know, in my period, you know, some people were very religious. They were, you know, there was a society called the Society for the Reformation of Manners, which was all about trying to clean up the streets. There were people, I found people, you know, there were people complaining about immigrants even then, you know, you know, and so you could sort of say, well, maybe that's true to a lot of the people at the time, but is that true to my character that I've got to know quite well? What would he think about it? And it's you know, you're sort of then thinking about, you know, is that authentic as you're writing that character? When you've obviously done it right, because, you know, the reader will have read that and thought, yeah, that is authentic to that character. It's the right thing to do. And that's the choice, I think, you're making. And the reader will go with it if it feels right.
Well, that's the thing, is how what can your main character get away with? And I think that we're willing to go with quite a lot, aren't we? When we whether it's a television series, we root for the main character, whether they're good or bad. I don't know if you've been watching Breaking Bad or whatever, but sort of almost irredeemable character,
anti-heroes,
you know,
or Game of Thrones. You know,
you still root for them.
You have the what's the good-looking one called, who pushes the little boy out the window?
It's Jamie.
Jamie, yeah, okay.
Oh, he doesn't, does he? That's ruined the plot.
No, it's in the first scene of the first episode, so you can no spoilers. But he pushes his little kid out the window, and then about 2 seasons later, you find yourself really rooting for him. There's an internal logic to his actions, and I think that's more important than likability. Actually, we had this in an earlier panel, so I won't go on about it, but we discussed whether likability was more important than someone being interesting, and I think someone being interesting is more important than being liked for a character. For me, obviously, I'm just craving your affection.
Was it Mary Renault who said that the late, great Mary Renault is one of the best historical novelists ever, that something on the lines of the enduring pleasure of reading and writing historical fiction was, I probably won't get the quote right, the tension between what is specific to a certain time and place and what is universal to people. And that's what's always interesting. I mean, obviously you can go one way or the other. You can make your characters more like us and more familiar, or you can make them more other and exotic. I think it's a broad choice. You should be allowed to play at either end of the spectrum. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point, because one of the questions I thought about asking and then didn't, because I thought some of you may have done this, but I'm going to anyway. Your periods, how much influence do they have on the basic storylines of your books? Because I know that, the reason I say that is because I know that, Giles, we've had a conversation in the past where you've said, actually, your English Civil War novels, at the heart of the story, yes, they're involved in a conflict, but the story basically could be any conflict.
Well, I was considering adapting it to the American Civil War to capture the market. It would only take a few little changes, Simon. My editor is here, so if you'd like to get on with that, Simon, that'd be fantastic. But it's taking it a bit far, but you kind of could do that. Yeah.
Can I chip in? I mean, one of the things I like about my series is that I pick a period where I know that there's at least one or two decent battles and an interesting thing that happens. So I shape my story around the historical events. The last one is called The Iron Castle. Sorry, it's a shameless plug. And it's out now in all good bookstores. And it's about the siege of Chateau Gaillard in 1203 and 1204, which was an incredibly exciting and dramatic siege in its own right. And when I read about it, I thought, I have to have this piece of history and stick my heroes in it. So basically, I'm using history as a crutch for my poor storytelling.
I was trying to say it in a nicer way, but that's exactly what I meant.
I'm very bad at endings. I've always, when I used to do contemporary set, fiction, and I could never think of an ending. And I'm not being facetious when I say, with the stuff I do now, you know what the ending is, and it's a blessing. It's there for you.
It's already been.
You don't have to worry about it.
Made up,
yeah.
Because that's the George Martin quote, isn't it? He was talking with Bernard Cornwell, and George Martin was saying basically that fantasy novels, upmarket historical novels, sisters under the skin. But as he put it, the problem he has with historical novels is, before you ever crack the book open, you know who lives and who dies. I think that is a problem with endings in well-known periods. I mean, Julius Caesar gets murdered. Blimey, I didn't see that coming.
But then surely, then you put the characters under the microscope, don't you? It becomes
it's
about
how they feel about
how they feel about being murdered.
No, you retreat to complete obscurity when no one knows the end.
Well, I don't have that problem because I'm not writing about sort of famous characters, individuals on the whole. They might, the odd one might wander in from time to time, but fundamentally, the characters that I'm writing about are kind of not ordinary people, but the kind of people on the streets, rakes and my main character is a gambler and a rake who ends up in a debtor's prison, but that story is true. What happened in that debtor's prison is absolutely true. There was a real story there, but not many people know it. In fact, so it gave me that kind of structure. I suppose I was lucky there, but I don't have that worry. That's one of the good things about a neglected period. No one knows about it, so so you've got the surprise.
Just quickly before I'll open it up to questions from everybody in a minute. But is there part of your personal histories that sort of kick-started your interest in your own period that you write in? Was there a moment that you could define?
It was when he was a troubadour.
Actually, no. It
was when he first fell in love.
Actually, it was when I first came back from war. No, I was a journalist in Afghanistan, and It was a very difficult time in my life, and I saw a lot of violence and bloodshed, and I also realised I really didn't want to die. So I stopped doing that and thought about what I wanted to do, and so I thought I'd write about other people dying instead. So that was the beginning of my journey.
Well, I actually teach Roman history. It's my day job and has been forever. It always irritates me when people, usually at cocktail parties, apart from they go, "Do you make a living doing that, writing novels?" Which always annoys me. It's the, "Why did you give up history to become a historical novelist?" As if there's some sort of automatic slumming it by being a historical novelist. Prostituting what little scholarship you had. I actually know I got into the classical world. My godfather, when I was 16, gave me Robin Lane Fox's biography of Alexander the Great, and I read it, and I'd never read a history book like it. It was digressive, it was personal, it was brilliant, and superbly written. And that's how I got into doing classical stuff, really. Yeah.
Well, for me, I've always sort of tried to make a career out of not working, and I'm still fairly successful at that. And having never had a real job, other than sort of making music or writing books.
So never having a real job.
Yes. I was really turned on by the idea of writing about a society, well, about people who lived outside of society's rules. So the sort of pirate thing, the idea that there are a bunch of people that just did what they wanted whenever they wanted. That appeals to me a lot. And if I could get away with that these days, you know, I probably would. But you can't. So I write about it instead. I don't know if anyone went to the British Museum and saw the the skull with the filed teeth, and the idea being that they put pigment in the teeth. They filed the teeth and put the pigment in there to sort of be very scary, for one thing, to show that you were capable of sort of inflicting pain on yourself as well. Also meant you were pretty hard. But also, they were people that were clearly saying, we don't play by your rules. We do our own thing, and that has always appealed to me.
Well, I think Anne Boleyn did whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted, up till when she didn't, you know.
When she couldn't, yeah.
No, not really, is the answer to your question. I think, looking back, I grew up and I read Enid Blyton's when I was little, and then I must have stopped those at about the age of 11. I lived in a house where there were no books and nobody read, with one exception. My mum would get Jean Pleiades out of the library, out of Potter's Bar Library, and I think I read them, but actually, as I've got a bit older, I think perhaps I didn't read them, actually. I think she just talked to me about them, and it came from there. You know, I grew up with those characters and then left them behind and did what I did in life. And then, as I say, you know, really late on, it was about as I turned 40, I thought, who do I really want to write about? And I thought, Anne Boleyn. And it started again for me, and I had to go back and, you know, relearn things, relearn it all, or learn it all. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I mean, yeah, only personally in the sense that I think, you know, these choices always are personal and you're not even sure why. So for me, it's often intuitive, and not only the period, but just then, you know, the stories within that. You know, when I'm doing research, something will pop out at me, and that's interesting. That's, you know, that's curious. You know, with the first one, it was, you know, I had this idea for a character, and I thought, where would he be at the beginning? He's a gambler, rake, not very good with money. Oh, he'd probably be in the debtor's prison. And then stumbled across this amazing story, and you know, and it's happened, you know, with the next ones, where the things sort of just trigger in your mind. Like, that, I have to follow that. I'm just interested in that. And hopefully, if you're interested, you can kind of convey that to your reader, and they'll be interested too. But it's a very intuitive thing for me, I think. So it's personal in the sense that I'm drawn to it, but I couldn't tell you exactly why.
Any questions? Look at that.
I have a question for Kristian about his main character that needed scenes that good novel character should not be doing. So what did your editor and what did your test readers say about that?
Yes, I was just about to. So the question was to Giles, what did the test audience editor think of a lead character basically being an anti-hero and committing bad acts?
Well, I don't know what the readers thought of it, but I do remember a conversation about actually not using the word rape, as though that would sort of somehow smooth...
Make it better.
Somehow slightly less shocking without using the word, which I found interesting.
It's a date.
So,
A Viking date.
so
Courting, they call
it's
it.
been so. It's been so long.
Courtship.
Yes, it's a Viking mating ritual.
I haven't read the scene for a long, long time, so I can't actually remember how. But he did regret it afterwards, if that's any consolation. And actually,
Makes it fine.
Oh, bless.
you'll have to read it to find out why.
It's very good. It's got some bloke on the cover going, this is one of the best novels I've ever read. Oh, I wrote that for him.
Yeah.
It is superb.
Thanks,
novel.
Harry.
Any other questions? James?
Angus, aren't you rather trashing the image of Robin Hood? Didn't he rob the rich to beat the poor? Captain Watson would be very upset.
That was, is Angus trashing the image of Robin Hood? Isn't he meant to take from the rich and give to the poor?
Okay, there never was a Robin Hood. Right. So he has no image to trash. Okay, we disagree. However, the thinking behind it was, if you were the leader of a gang of criminals in the Middle Ages, you're not going to be a cream puff. And basically, you would have been an extremely tough guy. And in order to keep order in a gang of criminals, I mean, even today, if you want to be a crime boss, you can't really be a good guy too. So that was what we're thinking of. And also, you know, if you look at the earliest sources, the ballads, for example, just quick example, in 1450, the earliest printed ballad is called Robin Hood and the Monk. In it, Robin is praying in a church. He's informed on by a monk. The monk goes and tells the sheriff. Robin is arrested. Robin's gang find the monk. They summarily execute him. There's a little boy who witnesses this murder, so they kill the little boy too. This is how the story goes about a gang of people. This is from the 15th century, but you know they've been talking about this for 200 years. So if in the stories they were casually killing children, what were the real people doing? That was my basis for making Robin Hood a gangster and as hard as nails.
Other questions? Yes.
Question for Antonia. I'm another Georgian aficionado.
Go Georgians.
Yeah. Yeah. My team.
You said right at the beginning that you were aware that it was not a very popular period. And obviously this is the year of Georgian, 1715, 300 years ago. Did you find that helped in any way?
Well, it's funny. I mean, and the weird thing is also, in my day job, I'm a publisher, so I was even more conscious of, you know, if there's a sort of rule that goes that Georgian period doesn't sell. So even as I was writing it, there, you know, but you know, these things that people say aren't always true, or they can change. That's the other thing, is that, you know, one year something is in fashion, and then as someone said in a previous panel, you know, don't write to whatever's current at the moment, because it'll have passed. But even if it hasn't passed, if it's not what interests you, why write it? And in the end, I just thought, I'm fascinated by this. To go back to what I said, I'm fascinated in this period. It's really interesting me. I want to tell this story. I guess I'll just have to hope that someone else wants to read it. And maybe that's a bit pig-headed, but it was just the only thing that I could do. I couldn't write something I'm not interested in. And I happened to be interested in this period, so there it was. Whether it helped having the century, there seemed to be a lot going on, and that was complete luck, because I started writing it in 2010. That did seem to help in that there's a lot going around. I honestly don't know. Maybe people liked hearing something new. I don't know. But I didn't have any choice in the matter, really, so I'm glad that you feel the same way about my period. Thank you.
Gentleman up there. Is there an era that they wouldn't touch with a barge pole, and if so, why?
Oh, me? Well, I guess so. I'm just going to sound like a stuck record. Just any period that doesn't kind of draw me in, and I'd have to really start reading and thinking about each one before. I think there's always something interesting. You know, part of the joy is learning. You know, I think that's part of what people like about historical fiction, is you learn as well as getting the story. So as long as I was learning something fresh and it intrigued me, and I was learning about interesting characters, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Sorry.
This is actually where a fight could break out.
Yeah.
I really don't know about any other eras.
So the answer is any other era.
I wouldn't do Roman. Nobody wants to.
There are a couple of things I wouldn't touch. I mean, Robin Hood, English Civil War, and Vikings.
No, I mean, this debate is, when I was sent it by Richard, this topic, I thought, well, that's going to be tricky because I don't actually believe my era is better and more worthwhile than any other, to be honest.
I wouldn't touch the English Civil War. Sorry, Giles, but no, I can't understand it. Basically, I don't get the kind of fine religious detail. I like the clothes sense of the Cavaliers, obviously. Who wouldn't? But then we must remember that the Nazis were very snappy dressers. One should back the democratic parliamentarians, but they're so dull. So basically, I wouldn't touch the Civil War.
I've got it. Something set in a Siberian gulag. I just find it hard to get any jokes, any humour, let alone if it was a musical.
Gulag the musical. I like it.
Well,
We'll all collaborate on it.
You've sort of answered these questions. I was actually just about to say myself, is of all of the other eras on the panel, which would you write?
Georgians, because I love gin.
Swiftly finding out which era is best.
Well, I do want to do a novel set in World War I, but no one on the panel's doing it. And it's a bit late, because it's 2014 already. I would probably like to do Vikings. I've done a proto-Viking novel with the Amber Road, which is where the Vikings come from only a few centuries earlier. And you get to read all the Norse sagas. And, the first Norse saga I read in Penguin Classics, on the first page, as they're riding off on their little Icelandic ponies to kill someone in a feud, one of the characters was called Ivor Horseprick. And you've got to work with material like that.
I'm actually working on a reimagining of Robin Hood at the moment. He's even meaner and even nastier, but with a sensitive side.
Yeah. A lot of love.
But yeah, I'll probably have a go at it.
Is there any of these eras that could just make you go, oh, yeah, that's really true?
No, I'll tell you what, though. I was in the Early People's Gallery at the National Museum in Scotland about a month ago with some friends of mine, and as they saw me running around, I love to go there. I love the jewellery, and I love the burial urns from about 6,000 years ago. Get that. They've got them in there. And my friend said, you should do this. You should write about these, whatever they are.
So when this talk comes around again and you've written that one, it'll be what inspired you to write burial urns.
Yeah, so maybe.
Maybe medieval for me, because when I was at university, that was Chaucer was my big passion. So I guess medieval, maybe.
Chaucer, the contract killer.
He was a spy. He was a spy.
Hold on. I can't believe he's just said that in a room full of writers. That idea is going to be done so quickly before we blink. Right, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. But please put your hands together.
We should have a vote, I think. Phil, sorry to steal your thunder, but
Angus
I think we should have a
very
clapometer.
determined to win this.
So, do we want to have love? Do we want to have vomiting in the corners, big women, big axes, or nymphs and shepherds pretending to be virgins, or true love? Can we have a round of applause, please, for love?
No.
Okay. Who wants Romans?
Even Con's not clapping.
Okay, Vikings and or stylish Civil War people. Tudors. And last but not least, those gin-swilling Georgians.
I think that's pretty unanimous. Go Team Georgians. Thank you very much to the panellists, or combatants, as I should call them, and thanks for your questions.
Thanks for coming.
glad you brought your notes.
Yeah, so am I.